I still remember the exact moment the entire night felt wrong, even though nothing had technically happened yet. It started with a sentence I never thought I would say about my own family dinner. My mother chose my glass first, before anyone else even sat down. My name is Ethan Miller, and that night I walked into what was supposed to be a simple family dinner at my parents' house in suburban Ohio. The kind of place where everything looks normal on the surface: beige walls, warm kitchen lights, the smell of roasted chicken and buttered corn. But something about the air felt too controlled, too intentional, like every detail had already been decided before I even stepped through the door. My mother, Linda Miller, greeted me with her usual calm smile, the kind that should have felt comforting but instead felt rehearsed, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror too many times. My sister Emily was already at the table, scrolling on her phone, laughing softly at something I couldn't see, and for a second I tried to convince myself I was overthinking everything, that this was just another ordinary night where I was being too sensitive again. But then I noticed it. Before I even sat down, before I could place my jacket over the chair, my mother moved in a way that was almost invisible, almost casual, but precise, as she reached for the glass set in front of my seat. There were 3 glasses on the table, identical, clean, filled with iced water and condensation running down the sides, but she didn't hesitate. She chose mine first. Not Emily's. Not hers. Mine. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a small decision, a simple movement of her hand, but it felt like something inside me quietly shifted. I sat down slowly, watching her as she adjusted the placement of the glass just a fraction of an inch, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the plate, as if symmetry mattered more than anything else in the world. "You look tired, Ethan," she said softly, sliding into her seat across from me, her voice gentle in a way that almost sounded caring, but her eyes didn't quite match the tone. They lingered too long on the table, on the glass, on my hands, then briefly flicked away like she was checking something in her mind only she could see. My father was not there that night, which made the house feel even quieter, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Emily reached for her glass without looking, still half distracted, and took a sip, unaware of anything beyond her own world. I tried to join in the normal rhythm of the evening, the small talk, the clinking of utensils, the low hum of conversation, but I couldn't stop watching my mother. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't nervous. She was too calm, too steady, like someone following a plan that had already been executed countless times in her head. And then I noticed something else that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Every time her attention drifted back to the table, it always returned to the same place, the glass in front of me, as if it mattered more than anything else happening in the room. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was imagining patterns where there were none, but deep down I felt it, a quiet certainty forming that this dinner had structure, intention, and something underneath it that I was not supposed to understand yet. The longer I sat at that table, the more I began to notice that nothing in the room was happening by accident, and the more I tried to act normal, the less natural everything felt. My mother, Linda Miller, continued moving through the evening with the same calm precision, placing food on the table, adjusting utensils, and speaking in a tone that was soft enough to feel safe, but structured enough to feel intentional. She asked simple questions about my job, about traffic on the highway from downtown Columbus, about whether I had eaten properly during the week, but every question felt like it carried something underneath it, as if she was not just listening to my answers, but measuring them. I responded carefully, choosing words that sounded ordinary, yet I could feel my attention drifting back to the glass in front of me again and again. It was still sitting exactly where she had placed it, aligned perfectly with the edge of the plate, the condensation slowly forming new patterns down the side, and every time I looked at it, I had the same quiet sense that it was not just a glass anymore, but a focal point of something I had not yet understood. Emily, my sister, seemed completely unaware of any tension in the room. She leaned back in her chair, scrolling through her phone between bites, occasionally laughing at something on the screen, her presence almost grounding in its simplicity, like proof that the world outside my mind was still functioning normally. At one point she reached forward again without hesitation, lifting her glass and taking another sip of water, her movements so natural that they almost made me doubt myself for a second, as if I was the only one noticing something strange that did not exist. But then I caught it again, my mother's eyes, not staring directly, not openly watching, but drifting in brief intervals that always seemed to land on the same target. Not Emily, not the table, me, or more specifically, the space around me, the objects near me, the glass I had not touched. It was subtle enough that if I blinked or looked away, I would have missed it entirely, but once I noticed the pattern, I could not unsee it. She never looked for long, never long enough to be obvious, but always long enough to suggest intention. I shifted in my seat slightly, pretending to adjust my posture, and I noticed something else that tightened that feeling in my chest. The way she paused before speaking, just for a fraction of a second, as if she was constantly checking an internal list only she could see. When I mentioned work, she nodded too quickly. When I said I had been busy, she repeated the word busy in a tone that sounded like she was storing it away rather than responding to it. The house itself felt quieter than it should have been, even with the faint sound of utensils and Emily's occasional laughter. The refrigerator hum, the distant ticking of the wall clock, the soft clink of glass against wood, everything felt slightly separated, like the room had been divided into layers and I was the only one aware of the space between them. At one point, I reached for my fork, then stopped halfway, not because anything had happened, but because I suddenly became aware of how controlled my own movements were becoming, as if I was beginning to mirror the same precision I was sensing from my mother. She noticed the pause. I was not sure how I knew, but I felt it instantly. The way her gaze flicked toward me for a fraction longer than before, then softened again into something unreadable. "You are very quiet tonight," she said gently, almost warmly, but there was something underneath the words that did not invite explanation, only acknowledgement. I forced a small nod and said I was just tired, but even as the words left my mouth, I could feel that I was no longer simply participating in dinner. I was observing it. And somewhere between the polite conversation and the perfectly arranged table setting, I began to understand that this was not a moment happening randomly in time, but a moment that had been prepared long before I arrived. It was not a sudden realization that something was wrong, but a gradual tightening of awareness, like a slow closing door I could no longer ignore, and by the time I understood what I was seeing, I was already certain that every movement at the table had meaning I was not supposed to decode. I noticed it first in the smallest interruption, the way my mother, Linda Miller, paused her conversation mid-sentence when the glass in front of me caught her attention again, her eyes drifting down with a kind of quiet focus that did not match the flow of a normal family dinner. She was speaking about something ordinary, something about grocery prices at the local store in Columbus, but her attention kept fracturing, returning to that same point on the table, the identical glass of water sitting untouched in front of me. I had not lifted it once since she placed it there, and yet it felt like it occupied more space in the room than anything else. Emily, my sister, was still absorbed in her own world, occasionally reacting to something on her phone, laughing softly at messages I could not see, completely detached from the subtle tension I felt building in the air. She reached for her glass again, taking another casual sip without hesitation, her movements effortless and unexamined, and I remember thinking how strange it was that one person in the same room could exist in complete normalcy, while another slowly began to feel like everything had been recalculated around them. My mother leaned slightly forward as she served herself more food, her posture perfect, controlled, almost careful in a way that made it feel less like relaxation and more like maintenance of a position. When she spoke again, her tone was unchanged, still soft and measured, but her words seemed increasingly disconnected from the moment, as if she was participating in a script that required her to remain calm no matter what was happening underneath it. I responded less than before, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was beginning to feel that every answer I gave was being stored somewhere I could not see, evaluated in a space I was not invited into. The glass in front of me remained untouched, and I realized I had started to avoid looking at it directly, not out of fear exactly, but because acknowledging it too clearly made the entire room feel sharper, more defined in a way I was not ready to process. At one point, my mother stood slightly to adjust something on the counter, and in that brief movement, I saw her eyes return to the table again, landing on the same exact position, the same glass, as if confirming its existence in a silent checklist only she understood. She did not linger. She never lingered. But that was what made it worse, the precision of her attention, the way it appeared and disappeared with controlled timing. I tried to focus on Emily, to pull myself back into the normal rhythm of a family dinner, but even she seemed to exist on a different layer of awareness, completely unaffected by whatever undercurrent I was sensing. The sound of her laughter, the soft clink of her glass, the simple motion of her hand moving food across her plate, all of it felt like it belonged to a version of reality that was just slightly offset from mine. My mother finally asked me another question, something about whether I had been sleeping well, but as she spoke, her gaze briefly flicked toward the glass again before returning to my face, and in that moment I understood. Something I had been resisting since I sat down. This was not a dinner where everyone was simply sharing a meal. This was a controlled environment where attention was being directed with purpose, and I was no longer certain I was observing it correctly or whether I was already part of it in a way I had not yet fully recognized. The moment I realized I could not ignore it anymore did not come with any dramatic event, but with a simple shift in how silence felt inside the room, as if the space between words had become heavier than the words themselves. I was still sitting at the same table in my parents' house in suburban Ohio, still surrounded by the same warm lighting and the same familiar objects. But something about the environment had begun to feel reorganized around a single invisible point. My mother, Linda Miller, continued speaking in her calm and controlled tone, but I noticed that her attention no longer drifted naturally between everyone at the table. It had narrowed. Each time she spoke, her eyes returned with subtle precision to the same areas of the table layout, especially the space directly in front of me where the untouched glass of water remained exactly where she had placed it earlier. I had not moved it, not even slightly, and the fact that it remained untouched now felt less like a neutral detail and more like an unspoken variable in a calculation I did not fully understand. Emily, my sister, was still detached from the tension I felt building. She leaned back in her chair, scrolling through her phone with the same casual comfort as before, occasionally reacting to something with a small laugh that felt completely disconnected from the atmosphere I was experiencing. She reached for her glass again without hesitation, taking another sip in a way that suggested absolute trust in the normality of the moment, and for a brief second I envied that kind of simplicity, the ability to exist without noticing the structure underneath what others might call ordinary. My father's absence from the table that night became more noticeable the longer I stayed silent, as if his missing presence left a gap in the balance of the room that no one else acknowledged. My mother asked another question, something about my commute from downtown Columbus and whether traffic had been heavy on Interstate 71, but even as she spoke, her gaze briefly lowered again toward the table's surface, landing with the same controlled repetition on the glass in front of me. It was never a stare, never prolonged enough to be obvious, but it always returned to the same point, like a habit that had become too consistent to be accidental. I began to notice that her movements were no longer just calm, they were timed. She would pause slightly before speaking, just long enough for a silence to form, then continue as if she had measured the exact duration needed for that silence to exist. Even her breathing seemed regulated in a way that I had never paid attention to before. I tried to focus on Emily again, to anchor myself in something familiar, but she felt increasingly like she was part of a different layer of reality, one that was not intersecting with mine in any meaningful way. The sound of her phone notifications, the soft clink of her glass against the table, the casual way she shifted in her chair, all of it belonged to a version of the evening that no longer felt synchronized with what I was perceiving. I remember looking down at my own hands resting near the edge of the table and realizing I had become unusually still, as if my body had started responding to the environment without conscious instruction. My mother finally stood to adjust something near the kitchen counter, and in that brief moment of movement, I caught the same pattern again, her eyes returning instantly to the table's surface, confirming the position of everything as if verifying that nothing had changed in her absence. When she sat back down, her expression remained unchanged, but the atmosphere did not return to what it had been before. Something had already shifted, and I could feel that whatever this dinner was, it was no longer simply an evening shared between family members, but a sequence of controlled moments unfolding exactly as intended, with me beginning to understand that I was not just observing it anymore, I was inside it. I made a decision in that moment that I could not fully explain even to myself. But it was not an emotional reaction. It was something quieter, something closer to acceptance of the situation as it was rather than how it appeared on the surface. I remained seated at the same table in my parents' house in suburban Ohio, still surrounded by the same warm lighting, the same carefully arranged dinner plates, and the same soft sounds of utensils and conversation. But internally, I had stopped participating in the illusion of normality in the way I had been trying to earlier. My mother, Linda Miller, continued to speak with her usual calm and measured tone, asking questions about my work schedule and whether I had been managing stress properly. But I noticed that her questions no longer felt like conversation. They felt like confirmations, as if each answer I gave was being placed into a structure she already understood. I answered her, but my responses became shorter, more neutral, as if reducing my presence in the dialogue would allow me to see more clearly what was happening around me. Emily, my sister, remained the only source of unbroken normal behavior in the room. She leaned forward occasionally, adjusted her hair, laughed softly at something on her phone, and took another sip from her glass without any hesitation or awareness of the tension I was beginning to feel so strongly. Watching her made me question myself for a brief moment, as if I might be the only person interpreting the atmosphere incorrectly, but that thought did not last long. Because I kept seeing the same pattern repeat in my mother's behavior, subtle but consistent, her attention always returning to the same point on the table, always circling back to the glass in front of me with the same quiet precision. It was not urgency that defined her actions, but control, and that control was becoming harder to ignore. I found myself no longer reacting to the conversation at all, only observing it, as if I had stepped slightly outside of it without physically moving. My body remained still, but my awareness had shifted into a different state, one where every small movement carried meaning I could not immediately decode. My mother stood at one point to bring something from the kitchen counter, and as she moved, I noticed again how her attention never fully left the table. Even while her hands were occupied, her eyes returned in brief intervals to the exact same positions, as if checking that everything remained exactly as it should be. When she returned to her seat, she resumed speaking without interruption, but the rhythm of the evening had changed in a way that was difficult to describe. It was no longer a flowing family dinner. It felt segmented, like moments arranged in sequence rather than experienced naturally. I realized I was no longer eating. I was no longer participating in anything except observation. Emily's presence, once grounding, now felt distant, as if she was not part of the same awareness level I was operating in. She existed in a continuous, uninterrupted flow of normal behavior, while everything I was noticing felt fractured into patterns and repetition. My mother asked another question, this time about whether I had been sleeping enough during the past week, and as she spoke, I saw it again, that brief downward glance toward the table, toward the glass, followed by an immediate return to my face. That single movement contained more information than her words did. In that moment, I understood that I was not being invited into understanding. I was being kept inside a controlled rhythm of interaction where nothing was meant to be questioned aloud. And instead of resisting it outwardly, I did the only thing that felt possible. I stayed calm, I stayed silent when needed, and I continued watching, because I had begun to realize that the most important part of this evening was not what was being said, but what was being repeatedly checked without ever being spoken. I remember the exact moment I stopped trying to explain anything to myself and simply began accepting that whatever was happening at that dinner table in suburban Ohio was operating on a logic I was not being openly shown, but was clearly being enforced in small, invisible ways. My name is Ethan Miller, and by the time the evening had reached this point, I was no longer sitting as a participant in the conversation, but as an observer of a structure that felt carefully maintained through repetition, timing, and silence. My mother, Linda Miller, continued her role in the evening with the same calm and composed manner she had shown from the beginning, asking me questions about my week, my workload in downtown Columbus, and whether I had been eating properly, but I no longer heard those questions as casual conversation. They felt like controlled prompts, each one designed to confirm something rather than discover it. I answered in the simplest way possible, keeping my voice steady and neutral, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I had begun to understand that speaking more than necessary did not add clarity to the situation. It only created more variables I could not track. Emily, my sister, remained unchanged in her behavior, and that consistency became its own kind of contrast. She continued to exist in a space that felt untouched by the tension I was experiencing, laughing softly at something on her phone, occasionally reaching for her glass without hesitation, her movements fluid and unexamined. Watching her made me question whether I was interpreting the environment correctly, but that doubt never lasted long, because my attention kept being pulled back to the same repeated detail, my mother's focus always returning to the same point on the table, the glass in front of me, the space she had arranged earlier with such deliberate precision that I could no longer convince myself it was accidental. I noticed that I had stopped shifting in my seat entirely. Even small movements felt unnecessary, as if the act of moving would interrupt something I had not yet fully identified. My mother stood briefly to adjust something near the kitchen counter, and even from that distance, her attention continued to return to the table at precise intervals, as if she was maintaining awareness of a specific condition that required constant verification. When she sat back down, she resumed speaking without any visible change in tone, but the rhythm of the room had already shifted beyond return. It was no longer a continuous dinner. It was a sequence of controlled moments, each one separated by silent gaps that felt increasingly significant. I began to notice that even Emily's presence, which had once felt grounding, now seemed disconnected from the pattern I was observing. She was not reacting to the same signals, not responding to the same undercurrent, and that difference created a separation between what she was experiencing and what I was beginning to recognize. My awareness had narrowed to a point where every gesture in the room seemed to carry potential meaning, especially those that were repeated without explanation. My mother asked me again about my schedule, her tone unchanged, her expression calm. But as she spoke, I saw it again, that brief downward glance, the same controlled motion, returning to the same point on the table before immediately lifting back to my face. It was not hesitation, it was confirmation, and I could feel that the repetition of it was not for my benefit, but for hers. At that moment, I understood something without it ever being spoken directly. The dinner was not unfolding randomly, and I was not simply a guest at the table. I was part of a carefully maintained arrangement where attention, timing, and observation were being managed with a precision that I was only beginning to comprehend. And the most important rule of that arrangement was that nothing important would ever be acknowledged out loud. I did not move at first, not because I was frozen, but because I had begun to understand that movement itself was part of what was being observed in that room, and anything unnecessary would only reveal more than I was ready to reveal. The dinner continued in my parents' house in suburban Ohio, the same warm lighting still casting soft shadows across the table, the same familiar sounds of utensils and quiet conversation continuing as if nothing unusual existed beneath them. Yet everything I perceived now felt layered, like two versions of the same moment existing at once. My mother, Linda Miller, continued speaking in her calm and measured voice, but I no longer processed her words as simple conversation. Each sentence felt like a test of consistency, each pause like a deliberate space for something unspoken to settle. I responded less and less, not out of defiance, but because I was beginning to understand that silence gave me more information than participation ever could. Emily, my sister, remained unchanged in her rhythm. She leaned forward slightly at times, adjusted her hair, and continued interacting with her phone, completely absorbed in a world that did not seem to intersect with mine anymore. She reached for her glass again without hesitation, and I noticed that even that simple action had become a reference point in my awareness, not because it was unusual, but because it remained completely unaffected by everything else I was sensing. My mother asked another question about my work schedule in downtown Columbus, her tone still gentle, still controlled, but I noticed again that her attention did not fully remain on me while she spoke. It always returned in brief intervals to the same position on the table, the same glass in front of me, the same carefully arranged space she had been monitoring since the beginning of the evening. I had stopped pretending not to notice it. There was no point anymore in convincing myself that it was random. The repetition had become too precise. At one point, I shifted slightly in my chair, and I immediately felt a change in the atmosphere that I could not fully define, not because anyone reacted outwardly, but because the rhythm of attention in the room subtly adjusted in response. My mother stood again to bring something from the counter, and even while her body moved away from the table, her awareness seemed anchored to it, returning in brief, consistent intervals, as if she was maintaining a continuous verification of a specific condition that never needed to be spoken. When she sat back down, she resumed her conversation without pause, but I could no longer experience the dinner as a single continuous flow of time. It had become segmented, divided into moments of speech, silence, observation, and repetition. I began to notice something even more important than the actions themselves, which was the way those actions were being checked repeatedly without acknowledgement. Emily's presence, once a grounding element for me, now felt like it belonged to a parallel layer of reality. She was not reacting to the same signals, not responding to the same subtle shifts, and that separation made me realize that perception itself might not be shared equally across the table. My awareness narrowed further, focusing not on what was being said, but on what was consistently being revisited without ever being named. My mother asked me another question, her voice unchanged, her expression steady, but as she spoke I saw it again, that brief downward glance, precise and controlled, returning to the same point on the table before lifting back to me. In that repetition, I understood something I could not ignore anymore, not because it was confirmed verbally, but because it was confirmed through structure, timing, and behavior. The dinner was no longer just a family gathering. It was an environment built on controlled attention, where every small action was part of a system I had not been told about, and I was beginning to realize that the most important thing happening at that table was not what anyone was saying, but what was being silently verified again and again without ever breaking the surface of the conversation. I understood by then that the most important changes in that room would never be announced, never pointed out, and never acknowledged in any direct way. And yet everything I was experiencing was building toward a moment where silence itself would begin to feel heavier than speech. The dinner continued in my parents' house in suburban Ohio, but the sense of continuity had already broken in my perception. My mother, Linda Miller, remained calm and composed, speaking in the same steady tone about ordinary things like work schedules in downtown Columbus and routine concerns that should have felt familiar. Yet every sentence she spoke seemed to sit on top of something deeper that was not being expressed openly. I no longer tried to match her rhythm with equal engagement. Instead, I allowed myself to observe, to reduce my responses to minimal acknowledgments, because anything more felt unnecessary in a situation where meaning was no longer carried by words alone. Emily, my sister, continued her uninterrupted behavior, scrolling on her phone, occasionally reacting with soft laughter, and drinking from her glass as if nothing in the environment required interpretation beyond what was visible on the surface. Her presence, once comforting in its normality, now felt like evidence of a separation in perception, as if she and I were experiencing two different versions of the same dinner without either of us being able to explain the difference. My attention kept returning to the same point, not out of obsession, but because repetition itself had become the only consistent signal I could rely on. My mother's eyes continued to move with that same controlled pattern, briefly lowering toward the table and then returning to me, never lingering, never breaking the flow of conversation, but always returning to the same exact location in space with the same measured precision. It was no longer something I could dismiss as coincidence. The structure of it had become too stable, too consistent across time. At one point, she stood again to adjust something in the kitchen area, and even from a distance, I noticed that her attention never fully detached from the table. It returned in intervals that felt almost timed, as if she was maintaining awareness of a condition that did not require physical proximity to monitor. When she sat back down, the conversation resumed seamlessly, but the atmosphere did not return with it. Instead, it continued to fragment in my perception, separating into layers where speech, silence, and observation no longer aligned naturally. I became increasingly aware that what I was witnessing was not a sequence of random gestures, but a controlled repetition of attention, where certain points in the environment were being checked again and again without ever being named. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, still focused on her phone, still unaffected, and in that contrast I began to understand that awareness itself might not be shared equally in that room. I was not reacting emotionally anymore. I was analyzing without intention, simply absorbing patterns as they repeated themselves in front of me. My mother asked another question about whether I had been sleeping properly, her tone unchanged, her expression steady, but as she spoke I saw it again, that brief downward glance, precise and almost mechanical in its consistency, returning to the same point on the table before lifting back to my face. In that repetition, everything I had been sensing until that moment aligned into something I could no longer dismiss as imagination. There was a structure to this evening that operated independently of the conversation itself, a system of observation and confirmation that never needed to be spoken aloud to exist, and I realized that I had moved past the point of questioning whether I was imagining it. I was now inside the pattern, observing it from within while it continued to function exactly as designed, without interruption, without acknowledgement, and without ever breaking its surface. I remember the exact moment the structure of that evening stopped feeling like something I was trying to interpret and instead became something I was simply witnessing as a completed system, already in motion long before I understood any of its rules. The dinner in my parents' house in suburban Ohio had not changed in appearance. The warm lighting was still steady, the plates were still arranged neatly, and my mother, Linda Miller, still maintained her calm and controlled expression as she spoke about ordinary topics in her soft, measured tone, but my perception of everything had shifted completely. I was no longer trying to participate in the conversation. I was no longer even pretending to follow it in the normal sense. I was observing repetition, timing, and attention as the only meaningful elements left in the room. Emily, my sister, remained unchanged in her behavior, still scrolling on her phone, still reacting to messages with quiet laughter, still drinking from her glass without hesitation, and her continued normality created a contrast that made my awareness of everything else even sharper. My mother asked another question about my schedule in downtown Columbus, her voice as calm as ever, but I no longer processed the words as information. I was watching the pauses. Between them, the way her eyes moved, the way her attention always returned to the same point on the table with quiet precision, as if confirming a condition that had never once been allowed to break. At that point, I stopped trying to analyze it as something new. I understood it as something ongoing, something that had been in place before I even arrived at the table. I noticed that my body had become unusually still, not because I was afraid, but because movement no longer felt relevant in a situation where nothing around me was responding to movement in a normal way. My responses to my mother became minimal, simple acknowledgments that did not attempt to engage or redirect the conversation, because I had begun to realize that engagement was not the point of what was happening. The point was observation, repetition, and controlled continuity. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, still detached, still unaware of anything beneath the surface, and I remember thinking how complete her version of the evening must have been compared to mine, how she could exist inside the same physical space without ever intersecting the structure I was now clearly seeing. My mother stood briefly again, moving toward the kitchen counter, and even from that distance I could feel the same pattern continue, her awareness returning to the table at precise intervals, as if the position of every object still needed to be verified even when she was not physically present. When she returned to her seat, she resumed speaking without interruption, but nothing about the atmosphere returned with her words. It remained fragmented in my perception, divided into layers of speech, silence, and observation that no longer aligned into a single experience. I no longer looked for meaning in what was being said. I looked for repetition in how it was being checked. Every glance, every pause, every return of attention to the same exact point confirmed something I could not ignore anymore, not because it was revealed, but because it was consistently maintained without deviation. My mother asked me one final question about whether I was feeling well, her tone unchanged, her expression still composed, but as she spoke I saw it again, that brief downward glance toward the table, precise and controlled, returning to the same position before lifting back to me without hesitation. In that moment, everything aligned into a single realization that did not feel sudden, but final. I was not uncovering something hidden beneath the surface of a normal family dinner. I was recognizing that the surface itself had been constructed to function this way from the beginning, and I was inside an environment where nothing important would ever be stated directly, only continuously verified through behavior that never broke its own pattern.